David Lee Roth broke down on stage as he revealed the painful truth about writing with Eddie Van Halen.
Most of these songs that I wrote with Ed we wrote in a very, very tiny little space. I myself started off in the exact same space. My dad was just starting in school on the GI Bill when I happened back in 1954. The Fender Stratocaster was released, and so was I. And we lived in student housing for about the first 10, 12 years of my life. It was very tiny, about the size of the drum riser here. And I had a little space that was for the washer and the dryer, and just enough for me on some cinder blocks with foam rubber cushion. When I met Ed, now Van Halen, I went over to their house over in Pasadena, California, and when I first walked into Ed's little, it wasn't even a room. It was identical to the way I grew up. Just tiny little, you had to go from...
David Lee Roth has always been known as the wild frontman. The loud voice, the dancing showman, the guy who could walk onto a stage and make the whole room feel like a party. But in Glenside, Pennsylvania, fans saw something very different. They saw Dave pause. They saw him get quiet. And then, while talking about Eddie Van Halen, they saw him fight back tears. The moment happened during David Lee Roth's show at the Keswick Theater, and it instantly hit longtime Van Halen fans right in the heart. Because this was not just another rock star telling an old road story. This was Dave looking back at the beginning of everything. Before the fame, before the arenas, before the fights, the headlines, the breakups, the reunions, and the decades of rock and roll history. This was Dave remembering a tiny room, a guitar, a tape recorder, and the young genius who would become Eddie Van Halen. On stage, Roth talked about how many of those classic songs started in a very small space. Not a glamorous studio, not some $1 million recording room, just a cramped little area where Eddie would sit with his guitar and Dave would listen closely, trying to catch the magic before it disappeared. That image alone is powerful. Two young guys sitting close enough that the whole future of rock music was basically happening between them, and then Dave's voice started to crack. For fans, that was the part that felt real. David Lee Roth is usually all confidence, jokes, swagger, and showbiz energy. But when Eddie's name came up, the mask slipped. Suddenly, he was not just Diamond Dave, he was a man remembering his friend, his creative partner, and one of the most important people in his life. He described writing with Eddie in a way that made the audience understand just how intimate that partnership really was. Eddie would play, Dave would listen, and then he would go home and turn those sounds into words, attitude, characters, and stories. That was the Van Halen formula. Eddie brought the fire from the guitar, and Dave brought the voice, the personality, and the madness that made the songs explode. But what made the story even more emotional was the full circle moment. Years later, after fame had changed everything, after the band had already become legendary, Dave and Eddie found themselves writing again. This time, they were not in a tiny room anymore. They were in a professional studio. The world had changed. The money had changed. The history between them had become complicated. But somehow, the writing process still came back to the same feeling. Two chairs, two artists, sitting close, trying to find the song. That is why fans are reacting so strongly to this clip. Because Van Halen was never just about big riffs and party anthems. Underneath all the noise, there was a bond. It was messy, competitive, emotional, and sometimes painful. But it was real. And when Dave talked about Eddie, you could feel that he still carries that history with him. For younger viewers, it might be hard to understand how massive Eddie Van Halen was. He did not just play guitar. He changed what people thought a guitar could do. And David Lee Roth was the voice standing beside that revolution, turning Eddie's sound into something dangerous, funny, flashy, and unforgettable. So when Dave teared up, it was not just nostalgia. It was grief. It was respect. It was unfinished business. It was the sound of a man realizing that some partnerships only happen once in a lifetime, and for the fans sitting in that theater, It felt like they were watching rock history become human for a moment, because behind every legendary band, there is always a small room where it all began. And that is what makes this moment feel bigger than one concert clip. It reminds fans that behind the biggest songs, there were real people carrying real memories. Dave may still joke, smile, and perform like the old days, but when Eddie's name enters the room, everything changes. The crowd can feel it. The energy shifts. The past suddenly feels close again. For a few seconds, it is not about fame, money, or rock mythology. It is about two young men who built a sound together, and one of them still trying to explain what that meant.